ChessDiagnostic.
Hello, and welcome to day 19 of 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. Today we're going to look at advanced concepts in pinning, and I'm going to basically prompt you at each step in the four-part thought process to solve these positions. Now, I've realized that I've given you lots of practice, but we need to go deeper, more explanatory when it comes to how to pick apart more complicated positions. Because that's really what it's all about, is figuring out how to play stronger, and when you're facing complicated tactical or strategical questions during a game, how are you going to figure out the solution? Because chess is ultimately just a puzzle, and how you think about that puzzle is how you'll play. So in this position, I'm going to give you 3 positions total, including this one. So this example position plus 2 practice ones. So in this position, it's white to move if you want to pause the video. But you can see that there's a latent pin along this diagonal. But first, we'll go through step 1. So I'll ask you, if you want to pause the video at each step, what is black threatening? Since it's white to move, we're trying to solve the position for white. We need to figure out what black is threatening initially. So his only threats basically are to take the rook and then checkmate on g2. The queen is threatening this pawn. So we can see those threats, and we can see that if the rook takes and we just take with the pawn, that black will be mating us. So we need to keep that in mind. So other than those threats, there's really nothing else that black could do. So what we want to do, well, of course, we should also look at queen takes g2 check, but we can see that if that happens, we'll just take with the rook, and there's no mate. So you want to make sure that that's covered first. So we'll move on to step 2, and in step 2, you're going to ask yourself, how can I move my pieces forward and take or attack something? Basically, you're going to look for all the checks, captures, and threats. So in this position, the 2 rooks don't really have any forcing moves. Of course, rook can take f4, but we have a back rank weakness as well. For example, if the rook took, then actually black doesn't even need to take it. He can just bring his rook in, and he'll get a checkmate. So all rook moves are out for us. So what we need to do is we need to look. Now, of course, we have the rook here, but the knight can take. And actually, if the rook moved here, then there would be checkmate. So that doesn't work. So the queen and the knight are surrounding the king. So we're going to look for forcing moves to threaten a checkmate. Now, knight takes f7 and knight to e6, even though it looks kind of ridiculous because it can be captured multiple times, we're still going to look at these moves. So if the knight takes f7, the king can take, or even rook takes. So there's multiple moves, and at this point, even after queen, we don't really have any moves, and black's threatening checkmate, and we can't take the rook. So that's definitely losing. And knight to e6. So you can see from step 2, we're kind of melding step 2 and step 3 together. But you can see from step 2, we found all the candidates, and from step 1 as well, and all the threats. So there's pretty much only one option through this process, without even calculating anything, where we pared down everything to knight to e6 or knight to f7. Because those are the only forcing moves, the only attacking moves in this position. Checks like here, here, and here by the queen, or queen takes g6, you know just by your intuition that those don't work, because you can see automatically that the king will take. So when we're looking for candidates, you are doing a little bit of calculation, but your understanding of activity should be in play while you're finding candidates. It's not a rote method, which a lot of people think by the book Alexander Kodov's Think Like a Grandmaster. He makes it sound like it's mechanical, but it's not mechanical at all, because you're integrating your intuition. So the only move here that makes any logical sense, and from our calculation, is knight to e6. So this is what we need to look at in depth. So if we play knight to e6, there is multiple captures, the pawn, the knight, but we can see that the pin, for example, if the knight takes, we'll just take the queen. So because of that pin, we can deduce that that move is out. Knight takes e6 actually just loses a queen for 2 minor pieces. So the only other move, because we're threatening, you need to look at what you're threatening, of course. We're threatening queen to g7 checkmate. Now, there's only 2 ways to prevent that. There's the knight back, which we know from our intuition, our understanding of activity, that a move back reduces the opponent's activity and it's weak. So we can see that we have a check here, and then actually we get checkmate with knight to g5. So the knight back doesn't work. The only other move is pawn takes. But with pawn takes, we can force a trade. If the knight takes, we actually can just take the queen, and that's okay. Or we can actually calculate if there's a checkmate. And our intuition will tell us there is a checkmate, because even though material's equal, we have the king against our queen and rook, and there's just no comparison. So if we look at all these moves, all these checks, we can use our intuition, even if we can't calculate it all the way till the end, that there has to be a checkmate somewhere. And there would be. Of course, these types of calculations at the end do take a long time, and you really need to look and go deep. But basically, you're just looking for all the king responses to each check. But know that even in this position, for example, we look at the evaluation. If the queen takes, we're still plus 8.5, so it doesn't even matter. You could decide to take the queen, or you could calculate. So normally in these types of positions, even if it's very complicated, it'll make it simple for you at the evaluation of the end. You don't need to look all the way till the very end of the checkmate, but you need to be able to look to the end of the line to evaluate. So we can see at this point, either we lose the queen, or we win the queen, black loses the queen, or we get checkmate. All right, so I hope from this initial position, I explained clearly the 4-step thought process. Of course, once you decide on knight to e6, step 4 is doing a blunder check, and all you'd do is you'd visualize the move and find all the forcing replies by black. All right, so we're going to move on to position 1, and we're going to do the same thing, but after you've solved it. All right, I'll see you there. In position 1 here, it is white to move, and you can pause the video now. Okay, so you could see from step 1 that black doesn't really have any threats other than this pass pawn, but it's not far advanced enough to be dangerous, and we're threatening, or we have a lot of threats, potential threats on the king side. So our step 2 is to find all the forcing moves. You can see that we have rook takes f7, queen takes rook, queen takes pawn, and we have the option to bring another rook into the game somehow. And we also have rook to e6 as a threat. So you can see there's multiple moves that we need to look at. We can automatically discount rook takes f7 because it's covered enough, and we just drop a rook. Queen takes pawn, we should look at a little more, as well as queen takes rook. So if the queen takes the rook, which is a check, then it actually just ends up a trade, and black can win a pawn at the end of the line, and he has multiple pass pawns. Of course, we can take this pawn, but once he starts advancing his pawn, it can get quite hairy for us. So it's not a clear win. We're going to look at other moves first. If queen takes, then we don't really have any more checks other than to give away this rook, and that doesn't really lead to anything. So the only other move we have really is rook to e6. Now, rook to e6 should be a candidate in your mind, because you'll notice that we have doubled rooks on the f file, and we're going for mate because he has a weakened king side here. We would love to bring another rook in, but unfortunately we have a weak king as well, and his rook can come in as well as he can swing his queen somewhere there. So, and also another point is that rook, bringing your rook up does increase your activity, but it's not forcing. So in step 2, you're looking for the most forcing moves, and then if you don't find forcing moves, you go to just moves that increase your activity strategically. So rook to e6, you can see, actually poses a lot of problems, because if the pawn takes, we actually get mate. You can also see that there's multiple ways to take it. So the pawn can't take, we just calculated that there would be mate. The queen can't move here to keep protecting the rook, because you need to notice that the queen is threatening the rook also. If the queen takes, it actually takes him away from the rook, and we get mate. So we need to look at other options if we play rook to e6. So we play rook to e6, black actually has rook to d6, but of course we're not going to take the queen because then that would just be a trade, but it's actually kind of a computer move because it gives away a rook, and you could clearly evaluate that it's actually winning for white because he's up a rook. Now even if he starts pushing his pawn, such as e3, so after rook takes d6, he can play rook, and then we could just trade queens with queen to f6. The computer's suggesting queen to d2 to take advantage of this diagonal and possibly win more material. But of course black can push his pawn. And at this point there's really nothing that black has except his passed pawn, and we're going to win it anyway. So if we go back to this initial position, we can see that once we've decided on rook to e6, we still need to do a blunder check. So rook to e6, what are the forcing moves? We already calculated pawn takes and queen takes, and there's no other check or capture that black has. Of course, rook takes pawn is ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense logically. So we can conclude that rook to e6 is winning for us, and we found it in a comprehensive manner. Alright, we're going to move on to position 2 now. In position 2, it is black to move, and you can pause the video now. Okay, so if we start from step 1, first you'll notice that white is threatening to take the queen. So we have to do something about that. Now when you notice moves like that are very threatening, normally when you're playing a position like this, you'll have an idea of how you got to this point. But of course when you're solving a puzzle, you can just notice, or you want to get in the habit of noticing all the threats right away. So when you look at a position, even if it didn't originate from a game of yours, you should notice all the piece relations is what you're really studying here. So pawn takes queen is a threat, and that's pretty much the only threat that white has. He's otherwise pretty passive with his rooks just sitting on the first rank. His rooks aren't occupying any open files. His queen's kind of on the queen side doing nothing, and this knight is not really well positioned. So we have two options. We can move the queen away. Well, not there because the knight would take it. We can move the queen away somewhere, or we could actually take that pawn. So this is where your understanding of pinning at a high level will come into play. Of course, if we take here, then the knight's pinned. So you can see that we're not really studying how to get into a pin, but we're using the concept, the idea of pinning, to use it in combination to go for a mating attack and to get a winning position, or to win a lot of material. So if we go to step 2, we could see that we only have two options. Either rook takes or the queen moves. So what we'll do first is we'll look at rook takes, we'll start calculating it, and then if that doesn't work, then we'll simply decide to move our queen. And this is how you can use your thought process to make your task much simpler. Now, this is how strong players are able to solve positions very quickly, and it looks effortless, because actually it does become effortless at a certain point when your thought process automated, it's automatic, and you're not having to invest tons of effort to calculate like a computer, because the human mind doesn't work like a computer. It doesn't compute millions of variations. We have logic and intuition, and we should use those at our disposal when playing chess. So the first move, rook takes g2, there's only one option really, and that's knight takes rook. Now it's pinned, so what we'd like to do, of course, you should notice that when you have a pinned piece, especially when you're checking the king or any other moment, you want to look how you can gang up on that pinned piece and put the pressure. So the next logical move in our calculation would be rook to g8. The only way that white can protect it and prevent mate is rook to g1. So our king is pretty safe, so we're not really worried about that, but there's two ways that we can increase our activity. So this is a point I want to make in your calculation. When you're looking at a combination or a series of moves, and you come to a point where you're not sure what to do, or you don't see any clear checks, captures, or threats, what you want to do is you want to use your understanding of activity and bring another piece or pawn into the game, and the greater activity that these ideas bring you will eventually lead to another force sequence. And this is how combinations come about. So you calculate an initial forcing move, and then you see how to stack on the pressure. So there's two ways to do that in this position. There's bishop to f4 and h4. So bishop to f4 doesn't really threaten anything right away. Now, if you're calculating bishop to f4 and then you're planning on doing queen to h3, actually that relieves the pin and the knight is threatening the bishop. But with h4, it's actually causing a lot of problems for white, because now we're threatening h3 to win the knight and go even further and get mate. So, for example, if the queen was here, it wouldn't work, because the queen could actually just chase the other queen away and then play f3. But the queen's position is quite bad, so he actually has to reroute the queen to try to prevent mate. So he plays queen to b1, and now we've played h3, and at least at this point we can calculate that we have a much more active position, and we're at least going to have equal material. So practically at this point I would say you should just play rook to g2. You can see that there's no way for white to prevent you from at least getting your material back, and at this point, or once you got to this point, you'd calculate further. But for our purposes, we're going to look at the whole position. So from the initial position, we went through step 1, step 2, and step 3 for our calculation. So the blunder check is once you get to this point here with h3, you would go back and you'd recalculate and make sure that there's no forcing moves. And unless you see a problem in your calculation, you would play rook to g2. If you saw a problem, you'd move your queen. Alright, so we're back at this point here with h3. The only way for white to prevent it is with queen to f1, bringing another defender on this g2 knight. So what should we do here? We see that we have brought every piece we can into the game. How can we further break down white's position? Of course, we want to look at this bishop that's not active. We don't want to relieve the pressure. When there's lots of pressure, especially on a pin, you want to keep the tension as long as you can. And when you do that, the opponent's defenses break down a lot easier. So the next logical move would be bishop to f4. And now actually we're threatening the idea of rook to h8 with a discovered attack, because this knight's not going anywhere. The queen and the rook and the king are totally tied up, and he pretty much only has pawn moves and a rook move. So we can do whatever the hell we want. So at this point, the computer's suggesting d5. I don't even know if a human would play that. Maybe he'd bring the rook in. If he just plays rook here, then actually we can just take with the rook or the pawn, and we actually win a piece. So at this point, it's totally won. He plays, or the computer's suggesting that he plays d5, but we just take it. The point of d5 was possibly to open up the king's position and get some checks, but it doesn't really change the position fundamentally. So even if he plays rook to d1 at this point, we'll still have the same idea. It's pretty much over. The computer's suggesting these checks because that's all he has. Now, even at this point, the computer will say to not keep up the pressure, but of course, a human could just take and trade down into a totally winning endgame. This bishop will stop this pawn, and we're going to win all these pawns with our king, and then get a promotion. So we'll go through the computer line here. You can see that there's really no other way. We could keep the queen, of course, but I would prefer to just trade down and keep things simple. All right, so we went through 3 total positions looking at the 4-step thought process and how we'll use it in these complicated tactical ideas. If you have any questions, just leave it in the comments, and I'll see you in day 20. Have a good day.